Okay, so we finally get to the good stuff on the course. Everything up to this point was setting the stage. But now we get to C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet, the first in his trilogy of science fiction novels. And as I said to you, I think at the outset, I have my own reservations about my own syllabus, but I think that the background reading is really helpful in terms of framing what Lewis in particular is responding to, but even Tolkien, creating the climate and the backdrop, which helps you to read their books better. I mean, that's why I do it. So despite my reservations, they stay on the syllabus. So obviously, my reservations aren't that great. But it does mean that when we're reading stuff that's not Lewis and Tolkien, and so that's my only quibble with it. But Out of the Silent Planet is to my mind almost a direct response to the book that we just read by Wells, and in fact Lewis himself mentions it very right at the outset, at a few points. In fact, refers to H.G. Wells and his work, and even in his work in the way that when he goes to outer space, what he imagined he would see based on that. So he's acknowledging that his imaginative sympathies and his whole intellectual framework has been conditioned to some degree by the fiction that he himself has read. And that's interesting because what he's doing there is not only acknowledging that he's read this, he's also alerting the reader to the fact that, and this is interesting hermeneutically, that what we read transforms the way we look at things. And the things that we presume about the reality around us have an effect on how we see it. So we see through the lenses. When we look at the world, we tend to think we look at it without any biases or presuppositions. At least in the Enlightenment, that was the thought. The scientist comes, he looks at the world, he does an experiment, he uses the scientific method, he comes away with certain observations and conclusions, and they're objective and valid, etc. And at least in the popular imagination, science thereby is, to some degree, unimpeachable and unquestionable. What science says is fact, and fact, if you're going to oppose fact, then you're in favor of superstition and bias, etc. So there's a sort of false dichotomy set up. But the imaginative writers like Lewis, and not only Lewis, all imaginative writers have always insisted that the way we look, the presuppositions that we bring to the world inform the way we see it. Our language is one of them. In fact, it may be one of the chief ones that determine the way that we see the world, because we see it not just with our eyes, but when we try and represent what we see, we have to use language to do it. And so language is part of the terms of and the conditions under which we understand things. Now, the whole area of knowledge that covers that is hermeneutics. And hence, as I say, when I came to faith, my interest in hermeneutics suddenly spiked. What are the preconditions for understanding? I'll speak to that a little bit later on the course when we come to the abolition of man and so forth, because I think it becomes more pertinent there. But here he is alerting us to the fact that when he had read H.G. Wells' First Men in the Moon, it made him expect certain things about what outer space would be like, namely that it would be outer space, that it would be vacuous, that it would be lifeless, that it would be a source of terror, that it would be inhospitable to humanity, that there would be no laws, like it would be suspension of all of the conditions of human life. And then when he comes to leave the earth, he ends up finding that it is contrary to those expectations, and more conformable with what we called the Ptolemaic cosmology, whereby the further you get up out of the Earth's orbit, the more life he finds, the more real, the more vitality, and the connections between all things become more clear to him. So he becomes less under the influence of this fallen silent planet. And we're going to come to see why he calls it the silent planet. That's part of his narrative here. So it's an interesting retelling, and it's a commentary on science fiction, and it's a commentary on the imaginative atheism of H.G. Wells. And the imaginative atheism of H.G. Wells is just the accepted Western view of the way life is. Namely, it has no purpose, it has no meaning. Relationships are ones that we forge, but there's no inherent relational quality between them. And that includes all things, not just in terms of physics, but also in terms of human relations, all the way down to the human family, and all the way down even to the human body. And as I said to you, in our day, I think that this idea has accelerated to the point where now even our sexual identity as male and female is up for questioning with the gender identity theory. It's just an extension of that same questioning of whether there are any laws or rules that our nature is subject to. And at the same time, it's not only a questioning of it, there's a push to embrace that as the means of progress. And we're going to see that played out in all three of these sci-fi novels. So without further ado, it begins with the characters, the protagonists in this, are similar to those in Wells' novel, insofar as we have a scientist on the one hand, and we have, in this case, a philologist whose name is Edwin Ransom. By the way, was modeled after Tolkien. Lewis is quite explicit in this. And this would have been read, incidentally, in the pub. This is part of Lewis and Tolkien's personal story, is that their stories were read in installments to their friends in the pub at The Bird and the Babe, The Eagle and the Child, little place on Oxford, or at Lewis's rooms back at Magdalen College, Oxford. But they'd be regularly read, I think, on Thursday night, and both of them, there's an element of insider information. So Edwin Ransom is based on Tolkien. Treebeard is Lewis, by the way. But you never know it unless you know it, and then you think, oh, okay. And so there's the harumphing and the loud voice. Like, apparently Lewis had a booming voice. And my professor of medieval literature, Elizabeth Revel, said that this was the case. You could hear Lewis down the, like speaking in here, you'd hear him down the hallway. Whereas Tolkien, as a lecturer, she said you could barely hear him speak. He was very quiet, and he was like not a large man. Whereas Lewis was big in every sense. Very gregarious, very friendly. He was the sort of I guess we call him an extrovert, in terms of he was the one who drew other people into his orbit. And Tolkien was a force in his own right, but just more of an introvert, less of a dynamic personality. But a geek, a philologist. Philologists are those who love language. Now Lewis himself loves language, but he's modeling this after Ransom, which I think becomes particularly funny when Ransom ends up on Perelandra naked, and the lady's laughing at his middle-aged dad body, as we call it now. Which, so there, again, you can imagine them like, oh, I'm going to get you for that, Lewis. But nobody else knows that it's a commentary, but they themselves are sort of chuckling in their beer. So it begins, and again, I like the human element to it. It is comical. But it's not out of keeping with what has already been established about the science fiction genre. Namely, we have a scientist, we have somebody who represents the humanities, and they are both going to go into orbit. Now, there are some additional twists that Lewis puts on this, and that is he introduces another figure by the name of Divine, who's a sort of a businessman. And that's an interesting twist on it. A man who is only interested in the commercial, practical applications of it. And I think it's an interesting and welcome and helpful addition to thinking about how both the arts and the humanities are in the minds of businessmen. The only interest is, does it work and how can we profit from it? And we'll see the development of these characters that goes on. One final thing. A man by the name of Ralph Wood, who's a really good literary critic. He was at Baylor University. I think he's still alive, I believe. And I believe he's probably now retired, but he's an expert. He's written a good book on Tolkien. I think it's called The Gospel According to J.R.R. Tolkien. Commented in a public lecture here in Toronto, I don't know how many years ago, over 10 years ago, but it's in print as well, that the differences between Lewis and Tolkien, and he prefers Tolkien, lie in the Protestantism of the former and the Catholicism of the latter. And specifically, he says that Lewis's heroes are individuals, whereas Tolkien's it's the collective, it's the group, it's so he says that's a product of their different religious communities. And I don't agree with him, and I told him that at the time, and for a couple of reasons. Firstly, Lewis is specifically directly speaking back to the conventions of science fiction, which have an individual going up into space, and he doesn't only have one, he has a couple. I mean, there's only one hero, that's true. But he's responding to science fiction specifically in a fantasy way, but still that. So, and the conventions of science fiction are that. You don't go up in a group, it doesn't work if it functions that way. But secondly, when by the time you come to that hideous strength, we have a group there that's resisting the iniquitous NICE. And it's an important group in Belbury at St. Anne. And one of the most important things they do is they pray. I don't think it's as simple and straightforward as he portrays it. And even where it does meet some truth, I think it's not due to anything other than the demands of the genre. And it's not because one's a Protestant and the other's a Catholic. I just think he's wrong on that front. But having said that, he is correct that we do have an individual here who's the most important figure, and that is Edwin Ransom, and it is a philologist. And it is a philologist who has nonetheless been influenced by science fiction, and who nonetheless has had his worldview influenced by the scientific atheism of his day. And so he is going to have to change himself as the novel progresses. Now, when it changes and he develops as a character, he is going to fit in with this type of novel, which is called a Bildungsroman. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is one such as well. And a Bildungsroman, obviously a German word, is a translation. Bildung is self-cultivation, education. It